a really chilly night. I'm Wendy Sergio. I'm a member of the board of the World Affairs Council in Southern Indiana. Our mission is to inspire, inform, and create community around globally shared challenges and opportunities. And our World in Transition speaker series, of which this is a part, explores the ever-changing traditional and emerging issues that impact global well-being, featuring leading experts who share their take on how these changes impact the way we govern, how we work with other countries, and what it could specifically mean for the Indiana region. Sorry. Is that better? Okay. Coincidentally, today is Giving Tuesday, and I'm sure that you all have heard a lot about this, but if you would please consider supporting the World Affairs Council by joining as a member if you are not already a member, or consider gifting a membership to a student at $30 a year. Students will receive year-long opportunities for global learning and competency building. If you are a member, please consider making a contribution. There are QR codes, I believe, Cheyenne, yes, QR codes on the survey located on receipts. We are here tonight to talk about space. Does anybody in here remember the Jetsons? I saw a lot of Jetson reruns growing up. I had no idea. It only ran for one season. It was created in 1962, and the year in which it was set was supposed to be 2062. So if you think about the Jetsons experience, we had moving sidewalks, check that box, every airport has them. We had the talking watch, Apple Watch, many people have them. We had, they had video communication. Thank you, COVID. Everybody is on Zoom doing things all the time. What else do we have? Well, we don't have flying cars yet. We have self-driving cars that are still, still questionable. The robot maid, Roomba, or a knockoff, but they're around. So these things are, they're real. We also, if you think about Star Trek, if you're a Star Trek fan, when Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, that was set in 2265. The idea was to boldly go where no one had gone before. Well, does anybody have a GPS in their car? Satellite driven. We have an official space force. The US, India, China, Japan, Russia, increasing the accuracy, capability, and long-term ambitions of their space programs. We have an International Space Station, which is housing people from between 6 to 12 months out of the year, and it's not even newsworthy because it's happening. There are tourists in space. This morning, the New York Times had an article saying, if we go to inhabit Mars, we need to bring our own insects. So I'm interested to hear about that. But the future, my point is, that the future has arrived a lot faster than we imagined it would, and we need to be ready for it. And space is definitely outside of our borders as we consider them now, but it's not so far outside of our borders. So I'm really excited to introduce Kris Kimel and Nat Irvin, who are here to talk about some of the bigger ideas around space. Kris is the lead at Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of Space Tango. Prior to this, he started and led a range of entrepreneurial enterprises and initiatives, including as president and a founder of Kentucky Science and Technology Corporation, which is an independent nonprofit company with a reputation for designing and executing ambitious and diverse initiatives in science, technology, entrepreneurship, and disruptive innovation. He's also a founder of 2 subsidiary companies, Kentucky Space, which is a nonprofit, and Space Tango. That is a for-profit. Both focus on the design and development of entrepreneurial space solutions involving applications and novel space platforms for the International Space Station and small, high-value satellites. Kris is also the founder of Idea Festival, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with and miss, an international event centering on innovation, discovery, and creative thinking across different disciplines. Nat Irvin II is an author, innovator, futurist, teacher, composer, and former radio and television commentator. Nat serves as the Assistant Dean of Thought Leadership and Civic Engagement and the Woodrow M. Strickler Chair, Professor of Management Practice at the University of platform within Idea Festival to build innovation and dialogue. As a futurist, he guides Fortune 100 companies and organizations through strategic discussions on pivotal societal, economic, and technological shifts shaping our future. His influence extends to various publications, national boards, and educational initiatives, including advising TED challenges. With an eclectic academic background encompassing philosophy, media arts, music composition, and educational management, Nat embodies a visionary force across diverse domains. And I understand most recently he has been to NASA to help students launch satellites into space. Thank you to you both for being here, and hold on to your hats, redefine your borders. We're going to have a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thanks to all of you who have come here tonight. I think it's certainly very much appropriate that the World Affairs Council is hosting this conversation tonight. You know, one of the things that's, when you talk about space, the first thing that happens, and as I said, it's synonymous with World Affairs Council, is that you really can't talk about space and use the pronoun I. It doesn't work. When you talk about space, collectively, you'll notice it tonight that we will use the pronoun we. We will say we. When we, as a nation, John F. Kennedy as president, persuaded our nation to put a man on the moon, it was we. And that even though scientists, the very brilliant minds that would ultimately come together, collective group of scientists come together to be able to produce the science, the math behind actually putting a person on the moon, you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't convince the nation to do it. And so as our conversation unfolds tonight, you will notice how we somehow go to the pronoun of we. And it's, I think, it's sort of just a great way to walk into what I'm sure is going to be a great conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Kris Kimel, one of the amazing Americans, amazing members of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and who became my friend in 2007 and 8. Kris, thank you so much for being here tonight. And I, along with so many others who are here tonight, admire the vision that has driven you to now develop deep thinking about this whole question of humanity in space. Tell us a little bit about what the organization is all about. How did you get to that point where it became where you are now, focused on that kind of a conversation?
Sure. Well, it really...
You need to get a little closer to that. Yeah,
okay. Mm-hmm. Is that better? All right, thanks. So going back without too much history, when I was president of Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, we were in the process. We did a lot of different things. We invested in companies, and which the company still does, and did a lot of work in science and engineering. But also we had created some subsidiaries. One being Idea Festival, and then another was something called Kentucky Space. And we created Kentucky Space back around 2005 as an opportunity, because we saw an opportunity, and these were independent, in a sense, subsidiaries. They were subsidiary nonprofit companies to KSC. KSC was the parent, and our board kind of operated it, but at the same time they were independent 501c3s. And I had gotten involved in some space activities prior to 2005 and 6, and we actually opened an office at NASA Ames Research Center. Actually, a Kentuckian, a friend of mine named Scott Hubbard, was then the director at NASA Ames, and he actually was at one time the Mars czar. And he became the center director at NASA Ames in Silicon Valley, which is one of the major centers. And he came to me and says, "Hey, I want to convert some of this to a research park. Why don't you guys open up an office?" And one of my philosophies of life is never to say no to anything. You can always get out later. I said, "Sure, that sounds like a good idea." And so he gave us a really good deal. We opened up an office, And really, it was nothing more, the intent was I and some of our other staff members would go out there like once a month and hang out for 2-3 days. Just Silicon Valley, this is a place to hang out. And we just meet people and talk to people. And we actually were doing some work, doing some very, very early work on space, on asteroid mining at that point, and putting together some papers for NASA on that. And while I was out there one day, I was sitting there with a friend, Greg Schmidt, who now runs the Space System Exploration Institute for NASA. We were having lunch in the cafeteria, and he said, I wonder if Bob Twiggs is here. Bob at that time was the director of the Space Systems Lab at Stanford. And he said, they have an office here too, we'll just see it. He said, so, as luck would have it, Bob was there. I got introduced to Bob Twiggs, who I'd never met before. And Bob was the co-inventor of what's called the CubeSat class satellite at that time, which at that time was very, very experimental. There was only maybe a couple in orbit, and to a lot of people it was a big joke because they were so small. CubeSats are about that big.
This big, tiny.
So they're very, very small satellites. And so instead of spending a half an hour with Bob, I spent 3 hours with him. And we worked out this deal where I came back and said, boy, this is something that we ought to do in Kentucky because it's brand new, it's innovative, even though we had no money.
Right. Of course.
No plan.
Of course.
And to my knowledge, I didn't know anybody that knew how to build satellites.
Right.
We figured, what the heck? So that started the process. We did a contract with Stanford. We created Kentucky Space, and the original idea was that Kentucky Space was going to build CubeSat satellites. That's what we did, and that's what we did for the first 3 or 4 years. We started with high-altitude balloons, then we moved to suborbital flights, and then to orbital flights, and that's what we did. And then
Bob Twiggs. Now, where is he from?
Bob Twiggs was from. Well, he was the Space Systems Director at Stanford.
Right.
And just so you know, at the time, again, a lot of I was at several meetings with NASA people and Bob, and it was kind of the running joke about CubeSats. Maybe they're good for high school students. Well, there are close to $1 billion companies right now, close, maybe not billion, but $500, $600 million companies that operate completely with CubeSats. The military does, and it's become a huge phenomenon because what they basically functioned as was really because of the technology. It was the first time that things got small enough where you could actually create a very small spacecraft with enough power and capability to actually go into orbit and do things. And then with the opening up of the launches and things, that really, really brought it about. And so that's where it started. And then ironically, through the Idea Festival, one day because we were doing this and we were getting some publicity, I got a call from somebody who I knew about 9-10 years ago that I had actually done some work with in space, named Jeff Manber. And Jeff at the time, we hadn't seen each other in 7 or 8 years. He came across the Idea Festival online, and he called up my office, said, hey, I just saw this. I saw it's in Kentucky. Does Kris Kimel have anything to do with this? And my office said, yeah. So we reconnected. And he came to the festival a couple of times, I believe, and we connected, and he was still doing stuff in space, and we actually brought him on as a consultant to help us. And then one day he got a call from somebody, a key person at NASA in a private company who would come together and said, we want to start we have an opportunity, NASA's ready to put CubeSat-like modules on space station to do research in these miniature things. We need somebody to build them. Would you guys be interested?
And we're talking about the real space station.
Yeah, and we said, of course, our answer was, sure.
Sure, why not? Right.
And so we did that and jumped forward. We actually then migrated after several years out of CubeSats. Space Tango doesn't do any CubeSats anymore. And all of its work is now on the International Space Station. So now they have Space Tango, which I stepped back from being chairman of the board a couple of years ago. But Space Tango now has several proprietary laboratories on station, launches about 6 to 7 times to station, doing primarily biomedical work in space, looking at how different kinds of organisms, cells, technologies, plants operate in a zero-G environment. The idea that opening up new avenues of work, insights for Earth, or things that might be manufactured in space as well. And now things that I know they're also starting to get involved in some of the Artemis projects on the moon. So that's basically how it came.
Let's go back to, how about a round of applause for that? Right? Isn't that just like fantastic, right? I love that. So let's wrap up two things. Now, Bob Twiggs then moved from. Were you able to persuade him?
We persuaded, Bob actually came to Kentucky, he kind of semi-retired from Stanford, came to Kentucky for several years, worked with Kentucky Space, and was actually had a professorship at Morehead State University.
Right, so we got him to be a part of the Commonwealth, right? Okay, and then, so you create this this structure that leads to being able to launch CubeSats, right? All right, so now one of the things I remember early on in this discussion was that now we had, as part of a conversation, that things could be created, new chemicals would be created in space. Now, explore that a little bit. I think it would be great for the audience to understand what would be the value of launching these CubeSats. What were you doing with them? What was the idea behind that?
Well, the idea behind it is that zero G is a different physics environment,
Right.
and so everything behaves differently. And the idea behind it was, once we get past just some of the other things that were going on, the idea was, or the concept was, we need to understand at a deeper level how zero G might affect not only humans but other kinds of things, cells, plants.
Disease.
Medical devices, diseases, with the idea that learning how those things operate in a different physics environment, it could open up doors to a deeper understanding of those processes that can then lead to different kinds of treatments, different kinds of drugs, and perhaps even drugs and medical devices that are actually manufactured in space. And I'll give you an example. For example, Paula Grisanti, who's the head of the National Stem Cell Foundation, has been a very active player with Space Tango and also with other companies now, and flew a number of missions into space looking at certain things relative to Parkinson's disease and other kinds of things. So Space Tango and other companies do that. Space Tango also now just launched, I think a week or so ago, working with the University of San Diego. They've had several missions launching brain organoids into space. Brain organoids are derivatives of stem cells, and they mimic, in many ways, not always, but they do mimic certain processes of the brain. And we know now that those brain organoids age faster in space than they do on Earth. So they become a very interesting target to check, understand the processes and possible treatments for things like multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other kinds of neurodegenerative diseases. And so they do this at another company. Lambda Vision is another example, is a medical device company in Connecticut, and Space Tango has been working with them for several years. They have developed a retinal implant that they believe is a revolutionary device to restore sight to people with macular degeneration and other kinds of really serious eye diseases. And it's actually very interesting. It's actually a biomedical product. It actually works. It's a combination of about 100 or 150 incredibly thin layers of material that gets laid out into space, and it combined with a photon pump from the Dead Sea, which is a protein that acts as a photon pump when it gets in the eye. And the interesting thing is it to work at its full effectiveness, it must be manufactured in space. Because the 1G environment on Earth distorts the process. It's such a delicate process that it distorts it. So you want to do it in space. And so those are the kinds of things. In space, we and others, not just Space Tango, we've done plants in space. We've flown a number of plants that are the basis for lots of kinds of chemo drugs to see if those plants have a different cellular structure, other kinds of things that may, design them more effectively and things like that.
So I remember on one of the visits to Ames, we met with Barry Bloomberg, right? And who was the other scientist? Lynn
Harper.
Right. And one of the things she talked about was that it's possible that we would be able to, in these suborbital flights, to be able to fly a person in within a different gravitational field, and that some drugs that wouldn't work here might work there.
Yeah, that's certainly part of the speculation. We don't know that, but that's certainly part of what was part of the speculation, that it's not inconceivable that the zero-G environment may render the biology of the, we know that it changes the physiology of people, so, it could render something perhaps more effective.
So that's a part of the whole idea of
Right.
exploring just from the scientific and commercial possibilities, right?
So that, and to your original question, so when I was working at Space Tank, I got very interested in some of the deeper space issues.
Yeah.
And got very interested in how we as humans are going to interface with technology and make this next big leap out of suborbit, out of orbit, low Earth orbit, into the moon, living and working, and then ultimately onto Mars. Which is, we're closer to going to Mars now than we've ever been. Now, I don't know whether that means 5 years or 15 or 20. It's very unclear. But clearly, we're already, SpaceX is launching launch vehicles, testing launch vehicles for a Mars mission and a moon mission. So this is not something that's speculation. And of course, we've had robots on Mars for a long time, and those are simply extensions of us as humans. So, Wendy talked about we're actually already an interplanetary civilization.
Wait, just say this again, right? So you're saying that we're already part of an interplanetary species in
yes.
some respects,
Yeah.
right? Just explore,
Well,
just for the,
as Wendy
we
said,
just
we've
wanna
had
get
people
the-
in space since the 60s. We've been to the moon and back. We've had people living and working in space on space station and shuttle and other areas for decades. And we now have very, very sophisticated, smart machines and robots on Mars, which are simply an extension of us as humans. And in fact, robots and automation will continue to play a major, major role in any kind of deep space exploration. And so when you think about that, we're already an interplanetary species. We operate in several different spheres: low Earth orbit, the moon, geosynchronous orbit, and now on Mars. And deeper, we have satellites which have gone to Jupiter and beyond. Voyager, I don't know where it's at, somewhere in the universe.
Right.
And so we are already an interplanetary species without question. So it's not science fiction. This is happening today, which is one reason why it's so important for those of you like to be here today, which I really appreciate, because it's important that we, as a planet, have these conversations. This is not the future. Things like, what are the laws that are going to govern this? How are we going to deal with all this stuff? Is not speculation. We're having to deal with these things right now.
Well, let's just talk right there then, because on the one hand, we have this great sense of being an interplanetary species, and then you think about, okay, but what does that actually mean for us being on the planet? The last law I think that we had, or the original one, was in 1966, correct?
67.
67, okay? So now walk us through where we are from a legal framework as you see it, as this body, we as several countries, because generally it has been countries who have been able to,
Yeah.
we know about the commercialization, but give us a sense of where we are from the legal framework. Who owns the rocks on the moon, or who gets to go to Mars first? Do they own it? Just help us walk through that framework. How are we thinking about that?
Well, there
now?
have been accords since then, but the major outer space treaty, which was signed in 1967, as you can imagine, before we'd even been to the moon, it was signed by a number of countries. It's been kind of the guiding light that many people use to talk about this. And so, like, there was an article that came out recently, Can we own Mars? And we actually posted on our Humanity in Deep Space website, and we got comments back, oh, no, nobody can, this outer space treaty always says we can't. My own personal belief is that, unfortunately, we've learned from human nature that most treaties are ultimately abided by because somebody had a bigger gun. And so I don't put much, I'm very concerned about the issues that we think we have rules. Elon Musk has already said there's no rules on Mars. He basically will do what he needs to do, what he wants to do. And so the legal framework for space right now is very, very slim. We do have rules. There are some laws. Many of them haven't been tested. A lot of the, actually deep sea law is some of the law that we now use to make references to like can you own an asteroid? Can you own materials off an asteroid? The closest thing we have is some of salvage law and deep space law.
Deep sea law, salvage.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
but we really don't have a framework of law. We don't know exactly. One of the things that we did at Space Tango is we actually put up. I think we're the first ones that ever did. We actually flew hemp seeds into space right before the
hemp
pandemic.
seeds like HEMP?
Hemp, H-E-M-P.
Yeah. Is that the kind?
It took me 6 months to convince NASA it wasn't marijuana.
Okay. That's what I wanted to get to. Just to
I kept saying,
clarify.
promise you it's CBD, but it's it's not. I had to end up literally talking to the chief medical officer with the ISS to say I
promise you.
I actually brought in a PhD chemist. I said, look, you don't believe me. This guy is not. So. And one of the reasons we did it, we wanted to see changes. We actually brought it back, we planted it out, planted them in a field, and we did actually see some material changes in the plants that had been to space versus the ones that had. But one of the things we wanted to do, and we saw enough material change, and we thought, well, let's try this. And so we actually filed a provisional patent. And really, we wanted to do it just because we wanted to kind of freak people out and say to the patent office and say, well, okay, we want to file a provisional patent on this plant, which was changed and altered in space. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and that was the end of that. But we were also serious about it because we wanted to start making inroads and trying to understand at a deeper level what are the patent requirements going to be. What are they going to do? When you hear people now talk about, and this is a lot of this, you'll see things like there's a company that we just launched some liver cells in space. And one day we may be transferring livers, to humans, transplanting livers to humans in space. Trust me, nobody's doing that until they figure out how to get through the FDA. Nobody's putting anything in space in somebody's body until we get through a lot of those. So there's tons and tons of unknowns and regulations that have to be worked out before we get there.
Well, let's explore that for a minute. How successful have you been in getting law schools to get involved in just the notion of, I guess we would call it space law, or you could even, maybe you just mentioned patent law, which is something that we easily can access.
Well, there are a number of schools that we deal with in humanity and deep space in this country, well, in particularly overseas in Europe, that are now getting into issues like space law. You've hit a note with me because unfortunately, I've been in Kentucky a long time. I grew up in Florida, but I've been here since the mid-'70s. And I have to admit, one of my frustrations with Kentucky is a great state of love living here is we don't have much imagination, or we lack imagination oftentimes. And so a couple of years ago, I was invited to go to Harvard to speak at Harvard Law School about space law. And again, not that I'm an expert in it, I'm not an attorney, but they were probably I was like, Waldo is probably the closest thing they could find, because I'd started a space company, and they go, this guy's from Kentucky, but you probably can't do any harm. So I literally went up there and did a talk, and there was, it was just, it was just a meeting like this, and there was probably 60, 70 people there from the law school students and actually Harvard Business School. It was an interesting discussion and got into a lot of issues. And I can tell you that efforts in Lexington and Louisville with the universities have been zero. I mean, I can't get anybody really interested in any of this. And so there are a lot of areas in this that are ripe for imagination and breakthroughs in this as we leave the planet. There are so many challenges that we have to solve or have to try to solve. And many of those challenges also have analogs on Earth. I often tell people, if we can figure out how to grow strawberries on Mars, we might be able to grow them in the middle of the Sahara Desert, because we're having to overcome so many different challenges and things like that. So it's not pie in the sky. It's not like, oh, well, who cares what we can do up there? It is about learning and about knowledge, and there are many, many of those things. There's just, there's a lot of, I'm dealing now with a company that I just got involved with in the Netherlands, which is associated with the university. This company is trying to figure out whether it's possible for humans to reproduce in space.
Oh, did you just sex in space?
Sex in space.
I knew it wouldn't be long. Yeah.
Because we don't know that. People talk about colonization. We have no idea whether it's even remotely possible for humans to safely reproduce in a zero-G environment. And if we can't, then having a million people on Mars is going to be really hard.
Well, let's talk about some of the knowledge that we now have about, since we do have some pretty good track records about extended periods of time in space. Give us a sense of what do we now know about the brain, for example? What do we know now about macular degeneration? Some of the unintended consequences or things that we didn't think we would experience from astronauts who, some of them from Kentucky, who have actually spent time in space over long periods of time. Can you just give us some perspectives on that?
And that's really what Humanity Deep Space is about. We're really interested in the challenges and the issues, both scientific and in the humanities, that are going to be needed for us as a civilization to do this right, to maintain our humanity and our humanness as we leave the planet. And so the interplay between science and humans and technology and the arts and philosophy are all part of this mix that we need to deal with, because there's lots of ethical issues that have yet to be confronted. We know quite a bit about physiology from things like the Apollo missions and before that, after that, and before that, and certainly ISS. But we also know very little. The longest a human has been in space so far has been a little over a year. Of course, we were to the moon; those were like week-long trips. The space station is 265 miles up, which isn't that far, and it's under the Van Allen belt. So there's lots of issues. We really don't have a very good idea at all about how we're going to deal in deep space or for extended exposure to space. Physiologically, we already know that there are bone muscle issues, deterioration. They've determined now that they've found in some astronauts there's a swelling in the eye, behind the eye, that causes problems. Sometimes it reverses, sometimes, if I understand, it doesn't. I know that I read an article not too long ago where they were suggesting that anybody that's been in space for 6 months or more should not fly again for 3 years because of changes, some possible biomedical changes in the brain that they've seen. There's all sorts of things, and again, all life on Earth, going back 4 billion years or whenever the first cellular or multicellular life began 3 billion years ago, has evolved in a 1G environment. Everything, all forms of life. And when you talk about going to space, you're talking about taking organisms like us or whatever it is and putting them in a 0G environment for extended periods of time. And we really don't know, because we can't know until we try it. Because there's no way to simulate 0G on Earth. People ask me all the time, well, doesn't NASA have a lab somewhere where you can, and the answer is no, you have to go to space. And so we really don't have a good handle on what the effects, over the long term might be on this. And it gets into all sorts of things. It gets into not just, normal things we think about, some of the physiological things, but also things like psychology, the idea of being exposed to space for long periods of time, isolation. An early trip to Mars for humans before we get into the Star Trek days 2,000 years from now is about a 2.5 to 3 year trip, because it takes you 6 months to get there. You're going to have to circumnavigate the planet or land. Maybe I doubt they'll land the first time, but maybe they do. You can really only come or go every 2 years because of orbital alignment. That's the shortest distance. And then it's 6 months back. And so it's, and I asked, for example, and so NASA has estimated that a crew of 4 or 5 on an initial trip to Mars for 3 years is going to require 29,000 pounds of food. So ask yourself, well, where's that going to come from? Everything's weight and mass in space. And the idea that somehow we're going to eat, pills for 3 years is ridiculous. And this is where the humanities comes in, because food has been essential to humans since the beginning of time. It's been a major part of our life, our existence, our happiness, all those kinds of things. And, so that's one of those problems that we've got to figure out what we're going to do about that. And people say, well, we've learned a lot from people on station. Space station's 265 miles up. They get fresh food delivered every 3 months. That's not the same as being 4 months into a 6-month trip to Mars in a capsule. And again, because of the physics of space, you have no sense of movement. It's just dark. And you start getting into issues of food and you know, the diversity of food, and what are you going to eat, not just for nutritional purposes. And you don't have to just survive, you have to thrive. So it's not enough to just say, well, you know, everybody needs 1,900 calories, and as long as we give them that, they're going to be okay. You know, they're probably not going to be okay. And so you get into a range of those issues, again, isolation, food, you know, what happens if somebody gets sick? You know, if on a mission with 5 or 6 people, there's all sorts of challenging but also very interesting things that we have, hard problems that we have to confront. And I don't mean to be, it's important, we had some conversations earlier, which is interesting. It's not to be pessimistic or say we can't do them. I mean, I don't want anybody to say, oh, this is hard, just forget it. But it does mean that we have to get busy now trying to solve them, because they're not going to go away. And not only do we have obligations, you know, ethical obligations for us as people on earth, but, you know, even even though people say, oh, you know, people, as long as they say they want to go, that's okay. People have done that forever. I get that, and that's okay. But you also don't want to knowingly expose people, humans, to really, really terrible conditions that, you know, high likelihood of not only death, but a very terrible death.
Kris, how would you respond to this? This is a philosophical question that I think as a species we from time to time will wrestle with. But from a practical standpoint, citizens of America, other countries, Japan, I'm speaking of the European Space Agency, they always have to confront the issue of, well, why should we spend money on this, right? Why should we spend money on it first? Second thing is, what is it that you think drives us as a species for wanting to go to the planet? You know this, that since I was 9 years old, I've been fascinated with the planet Jupiter. I mean, and I suspect people who are here, for some reason, you're here because you got bitten by the bug of space. My brother's a doctor, and it was because of the 1960s investment into space science. My brother used to collect all the rocks, all the, you know, those kits that we got, and that was the thing for him. But what is it that you think, just to close the question here, what is it that's driving us as a species? Right?
Yeah,
What do you think that is?
I don't know the answer. I think it's part of our DNA for whatever reason. I mean, we're you know, to explore, to search for, ultimately to search for food and to search for other kinds of things and things like that. I think it's just something that's wired into our DNA. I don't really know, you know, why that is or how it works, but it seems to be.
It seems to be something.
Something that's been with us from the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And we seem to be intent on continuing to do that. And again, when we talk about like going, you know, exploring, you know, I mean, we are the universe. This is not like we're going somewhere. We are the universe. As Carl Sagan said, humans are nothing more than the universe becoming self-conscious, conscious of itself. So we're not, you know, we are exploring what we are a part of. And I think that, you know, that makes it, that drives it, and that probably makes it, you know, I think that this, you know, that certainly makes it to some degree inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we go to questions from the audience, I want to tie this back to our own Commonwealth, the Commonwealth. We often, this group excluded, people, when you were getting started with this thing, the suggestion that Kentucky was going to be a player in the space race, people just didn't think that would be, that's something for the East Coast folks, right? And places where you already have, you know, the Johnson Space Center, Maryland, Ames, Houston, Florida. Give us a sense of just how Kentucky, why is this important to the Commonwealth? You talked about that a little bit earlier, but can you just kind of wrap that up with helping our audience to understand why we in the Commonwealth should actually care about this, even not from a philosophical standpoint, just from a commercial standpoint? Why should we care, and what's in it for us?
Well, first of all, it's exploding commercial business. I mean, it's just the money that's going into space right now is just enormous. I mean, it's just unbelievable when you look at the investments that are going in globally. So one, it is a new commercial frontier. It's not kind of science fiction. People are doing it now, and so it's important for states like Kentucky to play a role and have a place in these kinds of emerging industries and emerging opportunities. It's also an industry that drives and requires imagination, which is really, really, really important. And one of the things that we have not done, I think, enough of in Kentucky is, we do a really good job of putting together, assembling, manufacturing other people's ideas. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We want that. But it's important that we also begin to take more focus on generating those ideas ourselves. A car company comes here and they're going to make X, new tech. That's wonderful that we get that and get to manufacture, but we need to invent that. And a lot of the value is in the invention, and that's where you attract the kind of talent and maintain the talent to do these kind of things. So it's important. It's important from I think a commercial sense for us to be cognizant of that and to want to play and aggressively pursue these kinds of different kinds of things. The other thing that's important is one reason why Kentucky Space even was created is it's an emerging industry. It's not a mature industry. It's still very, very, very early. Very early. And it's important for states like Kentucky, places like Kentucky, countries around the world, to pursue things that everybody already hasn't done. It's important that we look at the frontier and say we're going to carve out a niche for this, and it's something that we think we can do and do well, even though it's risky, as only doing things that have been going on for, inevitably universities will somebody will get a $10 million grant for proteomics, and they'll say, they always say, it doesn't matter what the university is, they always say, and if I was there, I'd say the same thing, this is going to make us a leader in proteomics. No, it's not. We are so far behind. We need 10 billion to do something like that. So there's nothing wrong with that. We want to pursue that, but it's also important that we pursue those things that everybody hasn't already done. And there's an opportunity for us to do them and do them in a world-class way that makes us unique and special, because that's where a lot of that talent is going to be attracted to.
Let's take some questions from the audience, okay? Right, Will. By the way, I'm blind on this side. It doesn't mean that I don't see you. It means I just have to make a point to see you. So there we go, right there. Thank you.
I wanted to refer back to your question as to why this is important. Why is it important to go to space? What's the purpose?
I think philosophically, we're destined to do this, and I don't mean destined in a driven way. I think it's important for us to explore our neighborhood, and that's what it is. We are part of the universe. I think there's a tremendous amount of understanding and knowledge that is to be gleaned from going off the planet and having to develop the technology and the know-how and the wisdom to do that and do it well. And I think those, I'm not a big fan, even though I understand it, I'm not a big fan of the idea that, well, we need to go there because one day we're going to make the Earth uninhabitable, and so we need to go somewhere else. That to me is not a good reason. We'll screw this up, so let's go somewhere else and take care of that. But trust me, it's a lot cheaper to fix Earth than it is to go and think about terraforming Mars or something like that. But I don't know the answer to that, but I just think I do think it's important. I think we're going to do it. I think we've always done it as a species. We've always explored, we've always gone places. We've learned from it, sometimes good things, sometimes bad things. But I just think it's part of our existence.
The other thing I think, Kris, is comparing it to the way we have thought about. It's a wonderful book. I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. His first name is Lincoln, but he's right. It's called the Sea, and it's a history of our exploration of the sea civilization, our history of learning to go to this place where nobody had gone before. And there seems to be something within us as humans to want to venture into the unknown. And you can just think about those early people who would say, well, they tell me that the world is flat, but so I'm still gonna go, right? And the other comparison has been that we actually, a lot of scientists now say, we know as much about space as we know about the ocean, or we know as little about the ocean as we know about space. So it is that, so I think it is something inside of us that's going to make us appreciate better, this is my hope, is going to help us to understand better about the planet that we're on now, somehow, for exploring the one that's beyond. And I don't know exactly why that is, really. I don't know why that is, but I do think it must be something inside of us. And the first example for me was just how much I love the notion of how we explored the sea. And all civilizations have stories about that kind of thing. Yeah. Next question. Let's go back here in the back, and then we'll come up here to the front. Yes, nice and loudly too. Thank you. Please stand up.
Thank you for the comments and for the presentation. I just want to play devil's advocate about a comment that Kris said, that this is an emerging field and it's good for us to get there early, essentially. I challenge that emerging fields come from scratch. They build on many fields that we have not invested in this state forever.
Oh, absolutely.
And yes, it may look new, but it builds on technologies that we have failed to invest in. I'm a computer guy, I mean, but it builds on so many things that, so we're not really competitive even in a new field unless we invest in the foundations and in our society collectively in Kentucky.
You're absolutely right. And I didn't mean to imply we're already there. I mean, we have to make the conscious decision that we're going to begin to invest in those things. And you're exactly right.
Well, I guess we agree.
Well, and I think, and I say, no, well, and I want to say this, and
I love what you've done, and I appreciate it. I work at UofL, by the way. I speak.
And I've done tons of things to UofL, and I don't want to say this as a please trust me. I'm not saying this as a anything about me or Space Tango or whatever, because trust me, I have a master's degree in social work, so I don't know anything about this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's not like I'm some kind of people who goes, oh, you must have a PhD in astrophysics. It's like, oh, yeah, close social work, but I've always been interested in ideas. But I will say, and again, I don't mean this because it's not me. There's a whole team of people. I was just a cog, a little bit of smart. But Space Tango is one of a handful of companies in the world that has access to the International Space Station. I mean, that's why that they do work with Harvard, with Europe, with Australia, University of San Diego. It's one of a very few, and when Space Tango began, it began from zero. And, we knew it was going to be hard. I gave it like a 10% chance of probably succeeding when we started with Kentucky Space. So it's possible. It's not easy. And I don't mean to say that, that we did it the right way. It seemed to work. But you're exactly right. And fortunately, when we were building Kentucky Space, we were able to get investment from UofL and from the University of Kentucky and from NASA for critical capital that we needed to even start the company, because space is really, really expensive. I mean, it's incredibly expensive. And so I agree with you, and I also agree with you that if we decide to do these things, I don't know why. I mean, to be honest with you, why doesn't one of our law schools have a space law group? They don't have to have a department. What about, I deal with groups that deal with interplanetary agriculture. We're a huge agriculture state. Why don't we have somebody that finds one person and goes, oh, you're now our interplanetary agriculture person, and build out this opportunity. There are those kinds of opportunities that you have to take advantage. But we're not doing those kinds of things. And it doesn't mean you have to build the building and create a big bunch of money to just start something. You know, Space Tango or Kentucky Space was started with nothing.
Let's
Just
take
an
the next
idea.
question. Back here, and then up front, yeah.
How much of earthbound exploration has come at the cost of exploitation of indigenous populations?
A lot.
Or other populations, such as, you know, when you think about even the establishment of railroads in the United States, immigrants and formerly enslaved people were responsible for that, and so at the current stage of space exploration, we're currently, you know, probably more in the research and development phases. Obviously, we're not necessarily sending people, but you did talk about, you know, the challenging conditions of establishing those routes for exploration. So how do we, or have we as humanity come far enough to prevent further exploration of, or exploitation of other humans for the sake of exploration?
I have no idea. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I have and a lot of people have, is the whole issue of conflict in space. You know, we did a webcast a couple years ago with Robert Thomas. Robert Thomas was the captain of a nuclear attack sub. And we did that webcast because we wanted to understand from an analog standpoint, you know, they go underwater for 3 months. So we thought, well, there's some, you know, what have you learned about, you know, you're underwater? And the other thing he said to me, I asked him, I said, you know, when you guys are underwater for 3 months at a time, and you've done all your crew selection and all the training, what's the most important thing to keeping everything on an even keel with the crew? He said, food. Okay, so just throw that out. But I don't know, and I think it's a big concern. We don't know, because we don't know what's going on now. I mean, you know, unfortunately, we have a Space Force, do we need one? You know, I was skeptical, but yeah, we need one. Because even he told me, he said, you know, Kris, talking about space, he said, space is the ultimate high ground. All the problems that we're experiencing on Earth right now, there's no reason to believe that we're not going to just carry those upwards unless we figure something out. And I think it's a huge concern about conflict, militarization, exploitation. That's why I never use the word colonizing Mars, just for that reason. I always talk about settlements, because, you know, we've done that before and it doesn't work. And you know, so that's a big, and that's where you get into things like space ethics and space philosophy and things of that nature. You know, how do we do this? How do we do this properly? You know, what are the rules? You know, just an example of, you talk about space ethics and space and conflict in design. We're already experiencing that. You probably know a month or so ago, SpaceX decided to turn off Starlink, which was the communications hub for the Ukraine army. And they were going into something. Unquestionably, people died. Things happened as a result of them making a decision. Think about this. So we had a company make a decision about a technology in space by themselves that they were going to manipulate in a way that changed, you know, a geopolitical situation and cost lives. That has already happened. It wasn't a country, it was a company, one person, and that just magnify that by 100 times or 1,000 times once we get these technologies start going. You know, for example, you talk about ownership rights and things like that. There are several, for one particular crater on the moon that is supposed to have, they expect has a large volume of liquid, of water in the bottom of the crater through permafrost and other kind of things. Unfortunately, as I understand it right now, and I may be wrong, but I think I'm correct, there's only one way in, one way out. So if you're a country or a company and you get there and you say, hey, we got tons of water, come get it, but you got to pay for it, or you got to come through us. These are same thing with asteroids and minerals. These are the kinds of things that we're going to confront, and unfortunately, we haven't figured out a way to deal with these. We haven't figured out a way to even talk about them.
Question right over here in the front, right here.
Thank you. Throughout history, defense, control, power has created innovation. Because it seems like control and power a very important aspect of human endeavor. More for some, less for others. But that being the case, and what you just said about how we're doing things in space, they're already talking about new forms of weaponization. Why not move in that direction in Kentucky? For space programs is defense. Maybe you get more money from the right sources, and maybe you'll get more attention if you create that one success story.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think that's certainly a reasonable. You know, it's unfortunate, but I agree with you completely. It's certainly reasonable, and you know, there are options or opportunities in that area, and that's certainly unfortunately one of them is that there's going to be that's a big issue.
I mean, because the government does spend a lot of money
Oh yeah,
on research.
yeah.
And if you can, with your team, sell the idea to the government that we in Kentucky can and will create something you haven't seen, the money will come.
Yep, I can't disagree. Yes,
In the
sir.
back right here to the right, Doctor. Okay, thank you.
I think one area that I want to come forward on is how many problems we're able to solve on Earth because we have satellite imagery and sophisticated land use discovery. We know where people are burning rainforests with precision. We know how carbon is being sequestered from trees with precision. We are right on the verge of being able to create a really effective carbon market to protect land use patterns that are so important in forestry and agriculture. So there's so many things that I can model crop yields for any place on this planet and know before the harvest what the crop yield is going to be because we have the satellite imagery, we have weather information, climatology that has brought all that together in a way that you can take massive amounts of data. So there's so many problems that we're solving on this planet that we would be able to solve.
No, I completely agree, and that's an excellent point. That you're exactly right. We can't, it's GPS. I mean, look at all the things that we use, we take for granted right now. Even cell phones, technologies that have been perfected through, work, miniaturization, and things like that. Some of which had to be done. We're done with space. I think that's an excellent point. Now we're looking at possibly solar power in space, and I think just like the cell phone, if you looked at the first cell phone. Back when was the first cell phone? I don't mean smartphone, but what was it that first one came out?
60s.
Huh?
60s.
In the the ones that were for consumers. I don't know, 2000 sometime. Regardless of that, none of us at that point knew where it was going to end up. And it's the same thing with that. We don't know where these technologies are going to end up because they are driven by need, commercial, imagination, all those kind. In many cases, people do want to make it a better world, and so they're developing technologies to make it a better world, to help feed people that don't have access to food. And I think that's an excellent point that we often forget about, and I'm glad you brought that up. There are already many things that we use on Earth that are results of space that will continue, that if we continue to strive and we continue with our imagination and hopefully our ethics, we'll continue to drive those kinds of things. I want to pose one question to you before we close, if I have a minute or two, because to me this is one of the most profound issues that we face from an interesting philosophical standpoint. What do we do if we go to Mars as humans and we find evidence of primitive life? Not advanced, but life, multicellular. What do we do about that?
Look after it.
We have to base it off how we look at our past history. Every time we see something that's new,
Yeah, I think that's one of the more unanswered, really deep questions that we're facing, that as we search, that we actually find, we get obsessed with advanced life, but it's much more likely we would find primitive life on a.
That's
Well,
great.
yeah,
That's right.
primitive as opposed to Einstein. I mean, yeah, exactly. Life is life. No, I completely agree. And it's the same thing with animals, and we look at animals as, but you're right. I mean, other than humans. Yes, sir.
I think that was the last question.
He
according to our
must
old-
make one point. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Science is under attack,
Right.
and we have isolationism, which is not friendly for outer space.
Right.
How does that affect you?
It affects because it's sometimes because it's not easy to get research money in this country oftentimes because we're very inward thinking, and there's a lot of people who, why are we doing anything out there when we should be doing questions here? In my mind, it's never been an either or proposition. You have to do both, gentlemen, because we find things that we're not looking for. We have to do both. And I'll give you one more interesting point of why it's important that we need to take care of both. An astrophysicist, I read a book recently, and he made the point, which I think is really good. If we ever do find evidence, if we really want to find evidence, or ever do find evidence of any form of advanced life, it's going to take a very, very, very long time. People forget, I think the closest exoplanet to Earth is 4 light years. How much it'll take us to get there in current 40,000 years. So it's a big place. And so when people say, we haven't found stuff, in my mind, I believe the universe is infinite. And so it's beyond our imagination. And so I think you raise a really, really, good point. And one more thing, when we talk about impact, and we talk about even the environment. So this guy said, so it's going to take, he says, in order for us to do that, Earth has to survive a very long time. We as humans, as brains, as thinking organisms, have to survive a very long time. If we don't, if we destroy ourselves, or we destroy the planet, that's going to be, we likely will never, as a species, develop that. In fact, there is a thought among a number of astrophysicists that one reason that we haven't encountered advanced life yet is because, and this is just a theory, is because there may be some reason why civilizations are destroyed before they get to the point where they have those kinds of technologies. I think they call it the big sift or something like that, which raises another interesting, another interesting, which means if we find, this is interesting, if we find evidence of life on Mars, I don't care how different it is from ours, not primitive, just different, that changes the whole equation. That means that the probability of life is everywhere. And then that raises another question as to then why haven't we encountered it? So that has led some, it's just a position to some people to say that maybe that's one of the reasons. There's all sorts of other reasons. It's very far away and things like that. But yeah. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a round of applause to Kris Kimel?